The moment didn't explode. It didn't come with shouting or outrage or a dramatic walk-off. It came quietly, almost casually, on a brightly lit stage where everything is supposed to feel controlled. But in that silence, in the space between a question and an answer, something shifted. And for a few seconds on live television, the script that usually protects celebrities simply disappeared. Before we dive into this rare moment, make sure you subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thought in the comment below. Because what happened that night wasn't just another late-night interview. It was a rare crack in the system when a global superstar, still barely out of her teens, pushed back against the machinery of fame itself. And the host asking the questions, he wasn't expecting resistance. This is a story of when Billie Eilish sat across from Jimmy Kimmel on Jimmy Kimmel Live and quietly refused to play along. At first glance, it looked like any other appearance. The kind audiences have seen thousands of times. A young artist promoting her latest project. A seasoned host guiding the conversation with humor, charm, and just enough unpredictability to keep things interesting. The audience laughed on cue. The lighting was warm. The tone was friendly. But beneath that polished surface was something else entirely. Because by the time Billie Eilish walked onto that stage, she wasn't just another rising artist anymore. She was a phenomenon, a voice of a generation. Someone who had built a career not by conforming to expectations, but by rejecting them. She had entered the industry on her own terms. Minimal interviews, unfiltered opinions, a carefully guarded personal life, and most importantly, a clear discomfort with the very fame that had made her a global icon. That contradiction being everywhere, yet wanting distance was part of what made her so compelling. And it also made moments like this unpredictable. Late-night television thrives on familiarity. The rhythm is almost formulaic. A few jokes, a few anecdotes, a plug for the latest album or tour. The host leads, the guest follows. It's a system that works because everyone understands the rules. But Billie Eilish was never known for following rules. And Jimmy Kimmel, with years of experience handling celebrities of every kind, likely expected a certain level of ease. He had navigated awkward interviews before. He knew how to pivot, how to redirect, how to keep things moving even when a guest seemed uncomfortable. What he didn't expect was a moment that wouldn't move at all. Because sometimes the most powerful response is hesitation. In the days leading up to the interview, Billie's public image had been evolving. She wasn't just a teenager who disrupted pop music anymore. She was becoming something more complex, more reflective, more vocal about the pressures that came with her level of fame. She had spoken openly about anxiety, about the loss of privacy, about the strange reality of being watched, judged, and analyzed at every moment. And yet, she continued to show up. Award shows, interviews, performances, each appearance carefully balanced between authenticity and expectation. But live television is different. There's no editing, no second takes, no opportunity to reshape a moment after it happens. And that's what made this particular interview so significant. Because what unfolded wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. There were no raised voices, no visible confrontation, no moment that would immediately go viral for its intensity. Instead, it was something quieter, more subtle, and in many ways, more revealing. A question was asked, a pause followed, and in that pause, you could feel it, the weight of expectation pressing against someone who had spent years trying to push back against it. Jimmy Kimmel leaned in, doing what hosts do, keeping the conversation moving, filling the space, maintaining control. But Billie Eilish didn't immediately respond the way most guests would. And that's when the tone began to shift. Because live television doesn't hide discomfort, it amplifies it. Every second feels longer. Every expression becomes more noticeable. Every silence carries meaning. And for viewers watching at home, multitasking, half distracted, something about this moment pulled attention back to the screen. It wasn't loud, but it was real. And in an industry built on performance, real moments stand out more than anything else. This wasn't just about a question. It was about what that question represented. The expectations placed on young artists. The assumptions made about their comfort with fame. The idea that success automatically equals ease. For Billie Eilish, it didn't. And in that moment, sitting under studio lights, facing one of late-night television's most experienced hosts, she made that clear not with a speech, not with a confrontation, but with something far more difficult to navigate: restraint, the kind that forces everyone else in the room to adjust. The audience didn't know how to react immediately. The laughter faded just slightly quicker than usual. The rhythm of the conversation stumbled not enough to collapse, but enough to feel different. And Jimmy Kimmel, seasoned as he was, had to make a choice: push forward or pull back, because what was happening now wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a moment where control, something late-night television relies on, was quietly slipping, and the world was watching it happen in real time. What exactly was asked, and why it landed the way it did, is where everything begins to change. Because sometimes it's not the question itself that matters. It's who's being asked and whether they are willing to answer it the way you expect. By the time Billie Eilish arrived for her appearance on Jimmy Kimmel Live, the narrative around her had already begun to shift. She was no longer just a breakout artist who disrupted pop music with a whisper instead of a shout. She had become something far more complex, a global figure navigating the realities of fame at an age when most people are still figuring out who they are. And that tension between visibility and vulnerability had been building long before she sat across from Jimmy Kimmel. In interviews leading up to this moment, Billie had been increasingly open about the emotional cost of her success. She spoke about the pressure to constantly perform not just on stage, but in every public interaction. The expectation to be engaging, entertaining, and endlessly accessible. The idea that once you reach a certain level of fame, your personality becomes part of the product. For many artists, that transition happens gradually. But for Billie, it was immediate. Her rise had been fast, almost disorienting. One moment she was recording music in a bedroom studio. The next, she was headlining major festivals, winning awards, and appearing on some of the biggest platforms in entertainment. And with that visibility came scrutiny. Every interview, every answer, every expression analyzed, clipped, and shared. Late-night television, in particular, represented a unique kind of pressure. It wasn't just about promoting a project. It was about fitting into a format that had existed for decades. A format that thrives on quick wit, playful banter, and a willingness to go along with the host's direction. But Billie Eilish had never fully embraced that structure. She wasn't known for delivering rehearsed anecdotes or predictable responses. When she spoke, it often felt unfiltered, sometimes quiet, sometimes hesitant, but always grounded in a kind of honesty that didn't always align with the expectations of mainstream media. That authenticity was part of her appeal. It was also part of the challenge, because shows like Jimmy Kimmel Live rely on rhythm, a certain flow. The host sets the tone, the guest responds, and the audience follows along. And Jimmy Kimmel had spent years mastering that rhythm. He had interviewed actors, musicians, politicians, people from every corner of public life. He knew how to read a room, how to adjust when a guest seemed nervous, how to push just enough to get a reaction without crossing a line. But every now and then, a guest doesn't respond the way the system expects. And that's where things become unpredictable. In the days before the interview, Billie's public appearances had already hinted at a growing discomfort with certain aspects of fame, not in a dramatic or confrontational way, but in small, noticeable shifts. Shorter answers, longer pauses, a reluctance to engage with questions that felt too personal or too performative. It wasn't defiance. It was something quieter, a kind of boundary setting that doesn't always translate easily on live television. Because live TV doesn't leave much room for hesitation. The audience expects momentum. The host depends on it. And when that momentum slows down even slightly, it becomes visible. Producers notice it. Viewers feel it. And the person sitting in the chair has to decide how to respond. For Billie Eilish, that decision wasn't just about one interview. It was about how she wanted to exist within an industry that often demands more than it gives. She had already pushed back in subtle ways through her music, her visual style, her refusal to conform to traditional expectations of celebrity image. But interviews were different. They required interaction, spontaneity, a willingness to engage in a format that isn't entirely under your control. And that's what made this appearance on Jimmy Kimmel Live so significant, because it placed her in an environment where the balance of control naturally leans toward the host. Jimmy Kimmel wasn't there to challenge her, but he was there to guide the conversation, to ask questions that would entertain the audience, reveal something new, and keep the segment moving. That's the job. But what happens when the person being asked doesn't want to play that role? What happens when the expected answers don't come? The answer isn't always confrontation. Sometimes it's something much more subtle, a shift in tone, a hesitation, a response that doesn't quite match the rhythm of the show. And that's exactly what began to build as the interview approached. Behind the scenes, everything likely followed the usual structure. Pre-interview notes, topic outlines, a general sense of direction. These segments are rarely completely improvised. There's always a framework, a shared understanding of what will be discussed. But live television has a way of moving beyond that framework, because once the cameras are rolling, anything can happen. And for someone like Billie Eilish, who had built her identity on being genuine rather than performative, that unpredictability carried a different kind of weight. She wasn't just representing her music. She was representing herself, her boundaries, her comfort level, and the growing conversation around what it means to be young, famous, and constantly in the spotlight. That context matters, because without it, what happened next might seem small, insignificant, even just another interview moment. But with it, the shift becomes clearer. The pause becomes meaningful. The reaction intentional. As the segment began, everything appeared to fall into place. The introduction was smooth. The audience responded with energy. Billie walked out to applause, smiling, acknowledging the crowd. Jimmy Kimmel greeted her with the ease of someone who has done this thousands of times. The opening questions were light, familiar, designed to ease into the conversation. And for a moment, it worked. But underneath that surface, something was already different. Not obvious, not dramatic, just slightly off. The kind of difference you don't fully register at first, but you feel it. In the pacing, in the responses, in the space between words. And then, gradually, the conversation moved closer to the kind of question that late-night television often relies on. A question meant to be engaging, relatable, maybe even a little probing. The kind of question that usually gets a quick laugh, a clever answer, and a smooth transition to the next topic. But this time, it didn't. Because this time, the person being asked had something else in mind. And in the second that followed, the rhythm that had been carefully built began to break. Not completely, not all at once, but enough for everyone in the room to notice. And once that happens on live television, there's no going back to normal, only forward into whatever comes next. The question itself didn't sound unusual. On a show like Jimmy Kimmel Live, questions are often designed to feel light, even when they touch on something personal. They are framed with humor, delivered with a smile, and timed carefully to keep the audience engaged. And when Jimmy Kimmel leaned slightly forward in his chair, turning his attention fully toward Billie Eilish, it followed that same pattern. There was no visible tension in his posture, no indication that anything out of the ordinary was about to happen. The tone remained casual, controlled, familiar. He asked a question, simple, direct, the kind of question that, in most interviews, would pass without a second thought. For a brief moment, it seemed like the conversation would continue exactly as expected. But then, nothing. Not immediately, at least. Billie Eilish didn't interrupt. She didn't laugh it off. She didn't rush into a response the way many guests instinctively do on live television. Instead, she paused. It wasn't a long pause in absolute terms, just a few seconds. But on live television, a few seconds can feel much longer. The audience, which had been reacting comfortably up to that point, hesitated. There was a slight shift in the room, a subtle change in energy that's difficult to describe but easy to feel. Jimmy Kimmel held his position, still facing her, still waiting. That's part of the rhythm of interviewing. You ask, you wait, you allow space for the answer. But this space felt different, because it wasn't filled with anticipation. It was filled with uncertainty. Billie's expression didn't change dramatically. She wasn't visibly upset. There was no sudden tension in her face, no exaggerated reaction. But she also wasn't performing. Her posture remained still, her gaze steady, but not eager, as if she was considering the question, not just how to answer it, but whether she wanted to answer it at all. That distinction mattered, because most interviews operate on an unspoken agreement. The guest will engage, and the host will guide. In this moment, that agreement was quietly being reconsidered. Jimmy Kimmel, experienced as he was, gave a small follow-up, just enough to keep the conversation moving without forcing it. A light remark, a subtle attempt to ease a pause, to bring things back into rhythm. The audience responded with a soft ripple of laughter, but the moment didn't fully reset. Billie finally spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, not defensive, not confrontational, but deliberate. She addressed the question, but not in the way it was expected. There was no quick anecdote, no neatly packaged answer designed to entertain. Instead, her response carried a different tone, one that suggested distance rather than engagement. She acknowledged the topic, but she didn't fully lean into it. And in doing so, she shifted the dynamic of the interview. Because now, the conversation wasn't just about the subject of the question. It was about control. Jimmy Kimmel listened, nodding slightly, maintaining composure. From the outside, everything still appeared professional, smooth, even, but the pacing had changed. The natural back and forth, the rhythm that keeps late-night interviews flowing, had slowed. And once that rhythm changes, every word becomes more noticeable, every pause more significant. Billie continued, her tone consistent. There was no escalation, no visible frustration, but there was clarity, a subtle boundary being drawn in real time. She wasn't refusing outright. She wasn't shutting the conversation down, but she was redirecting it on her own terms. And that's a difficult thing to do on live television, because the format doesn't always allow for it. Jimmy Kimmel adjusted. It was almost imperceptible, the kind of shift only noticeable if you're paying close attention. A slight change in posture, a quicker transition to the next thought, an effort to regain the flow without drawing attention to the disruption. He responded with a comment that acknowledged her answer without pressing further. A decision to move forward. The audience followed his lead. Another light reaction, a return to something resembling normal. But the moment lingered, because even as the conversation continued, something had already changed. For those watching closely, it was clear that this wasn't just another segment. There had been a moment, brief, quiet, but undeniable, where the expected script didn't hold. And that's what made it stand out. Not what was said, but how it was handled. Billie Eilish didn't raise her voice. She didn't challenge the host directly. She didn't turn the moment into a confrontation. She simply chose not to engage in the way that was expected. And in doing so, she revealed something that rarely appears on shows like Jimmy Kimmel Live. The limits of performance. Because live television depends on a kind of mutual participation, a shared understanding that both sides will keep the conversation moving, keep it engaging, keep it aligned with the tone of the show. When that understanding shifts, even slightly, the entire dynamic changes. Jimmy Kimmel, to his credit, didn't push. He didn't attempt to force a more direct answer. He didn't challenge her response or circle back to the question with more intensity. Instead, he did what experienced hosts often do in moments like this. He moved on. But moving on doesn't erase a moment. It just places it in context. Because the rest of the interview, while still smooth on the surface, carried a different undercurrent. The energy was more cautious, the questions more measured, the responses more deliberate. Not dramatically different, but enough to feel. And for viewers, especially those familiar with the usual rhythm of late-night television, that difference stood out. It became the part of the interview that people remembered, not because it was loud, but because it was real. In an environment where most interactions are shaped to fit a format, this one briefly stepped outside of it. And that's what made those few seconds so significant. A question asked, a pause that stretched just a little too long, an answer that didn't follow the script, and a host, experienced enough to recognize it, choosing not to push further. All of it happening in real time, unedited, unscripted, and impossible to take back. Because once a moment like that happens on live television, it doesn't need to be dramatic to matter. It just needs to be honest. What followed wasn't chaos. There was no abrupt cut to commercial, no visible breakdown of the show's structure. On the surface, the interview continued exactly as it was supposed to: questions, answers, light laughter, and a smooth transition toward the next segment. But inside the studio, the energy had changed. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, yet unmistakable to those who were. Because once that brief moment of hesitation had passed, once Billie Eilish had answered on her own terms and Jimmy Kimmel had chosen not to push further, the dynamic between them had quietly shifted. The audience responded first. Their laughter, while still present, felt more measured, slightly delayed, as if they were recalibrating, unsure of how far to lean into the humor. Live audiences often mirror the tone set on stage, and for a few moments that tone had become more cautious. Jimmy Kimmel adjusted quickly. Years of experience made it almost instinctive. He leaned back into familiar territory, lighter questions, safer topics, moment designed to restore the rhythm of the show. His delivery remained smooth, his timing precise. To most viewers, it would have looked effortless. But the shift was there. Instead of probing deeper, he redirected. Instead of lingering on the discomfort, he moved past it, not as avoidance, but as control. Because in live television, maintaining flow is everything. And yet, even as a conversation continued, the earlier moment didn't disappear. It lingered beneath the surface, shaping the tone in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Billie Eilish remained composed. Her posture relaxed, but not overly so. Her answers continued calm, thoughtful, but measured. She engaged, but selectively. There was no sign of agitation, no attempt to turn the moment into something bigger than it was. If anything, her presence became more defined, more intentional. She wasn't reacting anymore, she was choosing. And that distinction carried through the remainder of the interview. For viewers watching at home, especially those accustomed to the polished rhythm of Jimmy Kimmel Live, the segment may have seemed mostly normal. But for those paying attention, the difference was clear. The conversation had boundaries now. Not spoken, but understood. When the interview eventually wrapped, it did so without incident. Applause filled the studio. Jimmy Kimmel thanked her, maintaining the same professionalism that had guided the entire segment. Billie acknowledged the audience, offering a small smile before exiting the stage. On paper, it was a successful appearance. Nothing went wrong. And yet, something had undeniably happened. Because moments like this don't rely on spectacle to leave an impression. They linger precisely because they are understated, because they reveal something real within a format that rarely allows for it. In the hours and days that followed, the clip began to circulate, not as a scandal, not as a controversy, but as a moment worth noticing. Viewers pointed out the pause, the shift in tone, the way Billie Eilish handled the question without escalating the situation, the way Jimmy Kimmel responded, choosing not to push, not to turn it into something bigger. It became a conversation about dynamics, about how young artists navigate spaces that were never designed with their boundaries in mind, about the expectations placed on celebrities to be endlessly open, endlessly engaging, even when the environment doesn't fully respect their comfort. And importantly, it highlighted something often overlooked, that saying less can sometimes say more. For Billie Eilish, the moment didn't redefine her career, but it reinforced her identity. She had always positioned herself as someone who values authenticity over performance, someone who resists being shaped entirely by public expectation. And in that brief exchange on live television, she stayed consistent with that. She didn't reject the platform. She didn't disengage entirely. She simply adjusted her participation, on her own terms. For Jimmy Kimmel, the moment served as a reminder of the unpredictability that comes with live interviews. Even with preparation, even with experience, there are instances where the usual rhythm doesn't apply. And in those moments, the role of the host shifts. From leading the conversation, to reading it, to knowing when to move forward, and when not to push. That balance is what keeps live television functioning. But it's also what makes moments like this stand out, because they exist right on the edge of that balance. Not breaking it, but bending it just enough to reveal something underneath. Today, in a media landscape where so much content is edited, filtered, and carefully controlled, unplanned moments carry a different kind of weight. They feel honest, unscripted, human, and that's why this particular exchange continues to resonate. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. Because in a setting built on performance, someone chose restraint, and that restraint changed the tone of the entire room. It reminded viewers that even in the most polished environments, authenticity can still find its way through, quietly, unexpectedly, and without needing to announce itself. If you want more stories that uncover the real moment behind live television, the ones that don't make headlines but leave a lasting impact, subscribe to Prime Talk. Like this video, share your perspective in the comments, and pass it along to someone who appreciates the truth behind the spotlight.